After visiting the 22 counties in Minnesota, I convened a broadband roundtable in my state on December 29th. I heard firsthand from many people about the importance of making sure that they have access to fast and affordable broadband. We've had success stories in our state as well. One story that I heard when I was out in a small town in Minnesota, Sebeka, they began diversified early into cutting-edge technologies, including fiber optic infrastructure, digital telephone switching, cable and satellite TV, broadband internet service to 100% of their customers. And they have a very high percentage, I think in the 70 to 80% of people that are actually purchasing this high-speed internet in a very small town in a remote area in Minnesota. The government of Carver County, Minnesota is leading a collaborative effort to interconnect county facilities with cities, school districts, townships, and other entities in the development of high-speed communications. Through a number of funding and technical assistance programs, Minnesota's Blandin Foundation's Broadband Initiative has worked in rural Minnesota communities to educate community leaders and to get these partnerships started. Despite these local success stories, however, much more needs to be done. The overall reality is that America has become an international laggard on broadband. In 2000, the United States ranked 4th among 30 nations surveyed in broadband subscribership, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Today, the U.S. is 15th on the list. So in the last 8 years, Madam President, we've gone from 4th in the world to 15th in the world. That is not the kind of progress that is going to keep this country moving and get us back on track. According to the International Telecommunications Union, the U.S. is now perched at 24th in the world in broadband penetration. Canada has a higher level of broadband penetration and digital opportunity than we do. Broadband adoption in the United States does continue to grow, from 47% of homes in March 2007 to 55% in April 2008. But the figure is significantly lower for those living in rural America, only 38%. And of course, we have to consider more than just access, as I noted earlier. We need to look at speed. We need to look at speed if we're going to compete with countries like India and Japan. So we have work ahead of us. All of us understand that broadband is a critical infrastructure for the 21st century. By one estimate, to give you a sense of what we're talking here about jobs, every 1 percentage point increase in broadband penetration per year would lead to the creation of nearly 300,000 new jobs. That's why it's essential that all communities, including our rural communities, have the opportunity to take advantage of the opportunities offered by this 21st century infrastructure. I want these jobs in my state going to Thief River Falls or Lanesboro or Crookston instead of going off to other countries like Japan and India. It is that simple. I want these jobs to stay in the United States. We've seen the challenge before to make sure that our rural communities are not left behind as technology develops. For example, there are still many Americans who can remember growing up in homes with no electricity and no telephone service. In 1935, about 80% of all homes in towns and cities in the U.S. had electricity, but fewer than 12% of farms in America had electricity, and only about 25% had telephone service, which was often unreliable. In 1935, President Roosevelt created the Rural Electrification Administration, REA. The REA helped organize and support farmer-owned electric co-ops to bring electricity to the farms. By 1949, this is from 35 to 49, more than 3/4 of all farms in America had electricity. So with those standards that were put in place, it went from 12% to 75%. That is an amazing achievement during a time of crisis because people believed that you could get this done. The penetration of telephone service actually took longer. In 1949, only 36% of America's farms had telephone service. That year, a telephone amendment was added to the Rural Electrification Act, which made loan funds available to finance rural telephone systems. In just a little more than a decade, nearly 80% of farms had telephone service. Even much of our modern transportation infrastructure, including paved roads and steel and concrete bridges, has come into existence only in the past 70 years, thanks to both the New Deal and President Eisenhower's Interstate Highway Program. Our broadband infrastructure presents us with the same challenge to make sure that no one is left behind. President-elect Obama understands that broadband must now be considered a basic part of our national infrastructure. He also understands that investment in our broadband infrastructure is essential to our long-term prosperity. A few weeks ago, in a weekly address, President-elect Obama announced that a key part of his economic recovery plan would involve increasing broadband deployment and adoption, saying, "It is unacceptable that the United States ranks 15th in the world in broadband adoption." On Monday of this week, I sent a letter to the President-elect applauding his efforts to include investment in our nation's information infrastructure as part of an economic stimulus package. I also asked that he consider these partnerships that we have seen work so well in our state, and that matching grants on the federal level to work with the local communities would be one way to spur broadband development. And I finally asked him to look at the fact that this is not just about communities that have no access. It is also about communities that have bad access, or slow access, or too expensive access. If we really want to get the broadband infrastructure in place, we have to make it work for everyone. Just as what Dwight D. Eisenhower did with the highway system in the 50s, and just as President Roosevelt did with rural electrification in the 30s and 40s. I believe that the economic stimulus package must include mechanisms designed to bring affordable and fast broadband to this country. An economic stimulus package should fully fund the Broadband Data Improvement Act, which I co-sponsored and which passed last Congress. Any economic stimulus package, as I mentioned, must also fund matching grants for community-level partnerships that demonstrate strong cooperation among local government, businesses, schools, healthcare, and others. Finally, one aspect of the nation's information infrastructure that may continue to elude us absent some type of direct federal involvement is the creation of an advanced interoperable communications network for public safety. I still remember hearing when one of our police officers was shot and killed in St. Paul, Minnesota, how those that were trying to apprehend the person, the murderer in this case, that when they were up in the helicopter, they literally had to have multiple walkie-talkies and telephones, sometimes 6 or 7, to try to match up with all the phone systems that were in use across our area. Well, since then, we've had improvement in the large metropolitan area of the Twin Cities in our interoperability. But we do not have that kind of matching and that kind of cooperation in the rural parts of our state, nor do we have it across the country. The first responsibility of government is to protect its citizens. The fact that our nation's police, fire, and other first responders, including those in our rural areas, still do not have access to such a network more than 7 years after the tragic events of September 11th is simply unacceptable. I believe that consideration of this issue in the context of broadband stimulus measures may present the best chance to address this continuing problem. Madam President, I join the President-elect and so many in this Senate in calling for 21st century technology to create jobs and help our economy be more robust and competitive in the long term. This is about creating immediate jobs, and we can get that with technological infrastructure. But it is also about creating jobs in a way that leaves us for something that will actually move this economy going forward. This technological infrastructure, whether it be the electricity grid or whether it be the broadband that I've spoken about today, is really our rural electrification. It's really our interstate highway. It is our generation's chance to build this infrastructure in a way that will fit the changing needs of this country and allow us to compete on a world stage. Thank you very much, Madam President. I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.